Let me tell you something uncomfortable. If a collapse were obvious, you wouldn't be watching this video. The most dangerous moments in history never felt dangerous at the time. In 1929, nothing looked broken. Markets were up. Experts were confident. People felt smarter than ever. That's why almost no one saw it coming. Here's the part that should worry you. Every major crash begins the same way, with the belief that this time is different. No alarms. No countdown. No warning signs that feel urgent enough. Just rising prices, easy explanations, and a quiet agreement that nothing can go wrong anymore. Right now, debt is at historic levels. Speculation is normalized. Risk isn't questioned. It's celebrated. And when everyone agrees the system is safe, that's when history starts repeating itself. If this were 1929, this would be the moment, right before people realized they were wrong. Not during the collapse, not after it, but right before. And the most unsettling question isn't whether another crash will happen. Is this, if it already started, would you even notice? The calendar marked September 3rd, 1929. On that day, the New York Stock Exchange had reached the most magnificent peak in its history. The Dow Jones Industrial Average stood at exactly 381 points. The weather in New York was brilliant. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky. People on the streets were singing along to Irving Berlin's famous song Blue Skies, which played incessantly on the radios. The lyrics were, in fact, like a summary of the mood, not just for that day, but for the entire decade. Blue skies smiling at me, bluebirds singing a song. Nothing but blue skies do I see. Indeed, they saw nothing else. No one noticed the dark clouds slowly gathering on the horizon, the approaching economic hurricane, and the great devastation looming at the doorstep. In truth, this was not blindness, but an intoxication born of overconfidence. The dazzling light of the 1920s had blinded the American public, severing their ties with reality. So how did the world get to this point? To fully grasp the events, we need to widen our perspective a bit. World War I had ended, while the European continent was turning into a smoking pile of rubble amidst ruins. On the other side of the ocean, the United States had transformed into the most colossal production machine history had ever seen. The transition from a war economy to a peace economy had been monumental. Factories were now pumping automobiles onto the streets instead of bullets to the front lines. Steel, once smelted to dig trenches, was now being used in the construction of massive skyscrapers that pierced the sky and defied the clouds. The Empire State, the Chrysler Building, these were not just office buildings. They were reinforced concrete monuments symbolizing the hubris and power of the people of that era. The change on the streets was dizzying. Ford Model Ts replacing horse-drawn carriages, power grids burying oil lamps in history, and jazz music tearing through the silence. The rhythm of life had accelerated. But this speed wasn't just on the roads or in the factories. A silent revolution was taking place in people's minds as well. The idea of being patient like the older generations, of working for 30 years to get rich, was now passé. There was no room for the word patience in the new American dream. Everyone wanted it right now. This social impatience flung the doors of history's greatest financial casino, Wall Street, wide open. Before the 1920s, the stock market was the closed-circuit playground of only cigar-puffing fat-cat bankers and industrial barons. It was unimaginable for an ordinary citizen, a local grocer, or a high school teacher to have any business in the stock market. But an ambitious banker named Charles Mitchell changed the rules of the game entirely. The man at the helm of National City Bank came up with an idea that was both brilliant and equally dangerous for its time. Why don't we sell stocks to the public? Mitchell turned bank branches into stock retailers. His slogan was simple: don't let your savings rot under the mattress. Become a partner in America's growth. This invitation to the public met with a response far greater than anticipated. By 1928, the streets of New York were charged with an indescribable electricity. The situation had gone so far that if you walked into a luxury restaurant, you could hear waiters whispering stock tips to customers. Even while taking orders, taxi drivers were explaining to their passengers through the rearview mirror how much RCA shares would rise the following week. The man getting shaved in the barber chair with foam still on his face would preach about the latest status of the stock market like an economics professor. What was happening was no longer a rational financial market movement, but sheer mass hysteria. General Electric, U.S. Steel, Radio Corporation of America, the shares of these giant companies were rising every day, every hour, even every minute. A paper you bought for $100 in the morning would be $110 by the afternoon. Mind you, this $10 earned without any effort or sweat felt much sweeter to people than the money earned from 10 hours of hard labor at the factory. Labor had lost its sanctity, and speculation had become society's new religion. But the real question on everyone's mind was this: how were ordinary people, these crowds, barely scraping by on their salaries, buying these stocks? The key to the great catastrophe lay exactly here, because most were not buying these stocks with their own money. There was a magical but deadly wand inflating the market called the margin system. What was happening was no longer a rational financial market movement, but sheer mass hysteria. General Electric, U.S. Steel, Radio Corporation of America, the shares of these giant companies were rising every day, every hour, even every minute. A paper you bought for $100 in the morning would be $110 by the afternoon. Mind you, this $10 earned without any effort or sweat felt much sweeter to people than the money earned from 10 hours of hard labor at the factory. Labor had lost its sanctity, and speculation had become society's new religion. But the real question on everyone's mind was this: how were ordinary people, these crowds, barely scraping by on their salaries, buying these stocks? The key to the great catastrophe lay exactly here, because most were not buying these stocks with their own money. There was a magical but deadly wand inflating the market called the margin system. To fully grasp this deadly mechanism, put yourself in the shoes of an ambitious investor living in 1928. In your pocket, you have only $1,000 that you have painstakingly scraped together. The voice of logic tells you that with this money, you can only buy $1,000 worth of stock. But the brokerage firms of that era were whispering the voice of greed, not logic, into your ear. No, they said. Why are you thinking so small? Leave that $1,000 with me as collateral and I will lend you $9,000 in return. Go and buy exactly $10,000 worth of stock. It sounds enchanting, doesn't it? With simple math, if your shares rise by just 10% since you also profit from the borrowed portion, you will suddenly make $1,000. In other words, you will double your principal in a single move. This was the fastest and most effortless way to get rich ever invented in history. This promise of easy money took hold of society like a drug. People mortgaged their homes and rushed to the stock market. They sold their cars and buried that money in stocks. Housewives pawned their family heirlooms and joined the lines at the exchange. Because to them, the market would never fall. It simply couldn't. It went so far that Irving Fisher, one of the most respected economists of the era, uttered that unfortunate sentence destined for the history books just days before the great crash: stock prices have reached a permanently high plateau. Yet, this sentence was less a scientific analysis and more a confession of the collective delusion experienced by an entire era. No one was looking at company balance sheets. No, one was asking, is this company actually making a profit? The question, what does the company produce, had long since given way to the question, how much is this stock making me? That ancient bond between value and price had been completely severed. Radio company stock could skyrocket even if it hadn't sold a single radio that year, because people were buying not the production power of that company, but that sweet dream being sold. However, this glittering margin system had a dark side that everyone ignored. What we call leverage is a double-edged sword. It carries you to heaven on the way up, but drags you straight to hell on the way down. The math was ruthless. If stocks fell by just 10%, your entire principal would evaporate in an instant due to the leverage effect. And that was the moment your phone would ring. The brokerage firm on the other end of the line would utter that terrifying phrase, margin call, meaning either bring fresh cash immediately to fund your account or I'm selling your shares at the current price at a loss. By the summer of 1929, a massive, invisible web of debt had been woven over America. On paper, the total stock market value had reached $87 billion. But the frightening part was this: most of this money wasn't real. It consisted merely of a massive bubble inflated by debt, fed by hope, and adorned with dreams. And by the laws of physics, every bubble waits to burst at its weakest point. In fact, the footsteps of the approaching catastrophe were audible. The signs were there. Industrial production had begun to slow, and factory warehouses were overflowing with unsold cars. Steel orders were plummeting, and construction was grinding to a halt. But the party on Wall Street was so loud that no one heard the agonizing groans of the real economy. The gap between the market and real life was widening further and further. On one side, farmers raising the white flag of bankruptcy because their crops were worthless. On the other, stockbrokers popping champagne atop skyscrapers Two different worlds, one single country. Now, does this landscape I've described sound a bit familiar to you? Close your eyes and think about today, the times we are living in. Even today, as world stock markets break records, isn't the real economy singing the same tune? Does that deep chasm between the scorching prices on supermarket shelves and the astronomical valuations of companies on the stock market remind you of that eerie silence of 1929? With the arrival of October, the weather in New York had started to cool. But the chill, penetrating people's bones in those days wasn't just seasonal. An eerie shiver was also circulating over the markets. And finally, when the calendars showed Thursday, October 24th, 1929, all hell broke loose. That day would be etched into financial history as Black Thursday. As soon as the morning opening gong sounded, sell orders poured onto the market like torrential rain. But why? Perhaps bad news from the London Stock Exchange, perhaps a rumor spreading from ear to ear, or perhaps just pure fear. The reason no longer mattered. Logic had checked out and mob psychology had taken the helm. To visualize that moment, forget today's silent trading halls with digital screens. That day on the ground floor of the exchange building, there were hundreds of men shouting, sweating, and pushing and shoving in fear, and that mechanical sound driving them all to the brink of madness. Tick-tock, tick-tock. This was the sound of the machines called ticker tapes, which printed stock prices on long, thin strips of paper. But that day, even those machines couldn't keep up with the pace of history. Prices were falling so hard and fast that technology was rendered helpless. Imagine, an investor thought he sold his stock for $100, but because the machine lagged behind, he would only find out hours later that he had actually sold it for $80. This delay in information turned panic into sheer terror. People were selling blindly without knowing what was happening. By noon, the market had lost 11% of its value. Rumors of suicide began to spread in the streets, and angry, fearful crowds besieged the front of the Wall Street building. As police barricades were set up, the same question was on everyone's lips. Has our end come? Right in the middle of that chaos, a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie unfolded. The heavy doors of the J.P. Morgan building swung open, and the most powerful bankers of the era gathered for an urgent rescue plan. Emerging from the meeting, Richard Whitney descended to the trading floor and, in a booming voice that everyone could hear, shouted his bid to buy U.S. Steel shares at a price well above the market rate. This was not a bluff. It was a show of force. The message was clear. Do not fear, we are here and we are holding the market. This bold move worked. The panic subsided instantly, and prices recovered. People breathed a deep sigh of relief. Thank God, they said. The bankers saved us from the noose. But looking back, we see that this relief was no different from the last cigarette offered to a condemned man. As the weekend intervened, fear continued to seep into people's minds, like an insidious poison. When the selling resumed on Monday, those savior bankers were nowhere to be found this time. And then, the darkest day in history arrived. October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. That day was the day the American dream officially died. It was different from the panic on Thursday. The sellers were there, screaming to sell, but there were no buyers across from them. The market had seized up. Stocks had become even more worthless than the paper. They were printed on even toilet paper. The fortunes of colossal dynasties like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts melted away by half within hours. But the real tragedy wasn't theirs. They were still rich. The true apocalypse broke for the small investor who had mortgaged his home and car to buy those stocks. Those margin calls we mentioned were now knocking on doors like executioners. Banks demanded their loans back, but there was no money to be found. Money had evaporated like an illusion. On that day, exactly 16 million shares changed hands. This was such a record that it would take 40 years to be broken. When the closing bell rang that evening, lying on the floor were not just torn paper strips, but shattered lives, ruined family honors, and a pitch-black future. An exhausted trader leaving the exchange building would summarize that moment years later with this chilling sentence. It was as if someone had turned off the lights not just of the stock market but of the entire world. If this crash had remained confined within those high buildings of Wall Street, we would simply call it a financial correction and move on. But that is not how things played out. That poisonous vine crept out of the financial system. It seeped into people's kitchens, bedrooms, and even into the lunchbox of a child going to elementary school. Then began that infamous wave of bank failures. When people rushed to the banks in desperation to withdraw their money. The only thing they encountered were locked doors, because the banks had squandered the hard-earned deposits of the citizens in the stock market. Just imagine, the money you had put aside for your old age, scraping it together for years, has vanished behind that locked door. To whom will you complain? There was no such thing as a state guarantee back then. No one to turn to. There are no words to describe the helplessness experienced in that moment. By the time we reached the early 1930s, the picture was terrifying. It is easy to say, but a staggering 9,000 banks failed. As the money supply collapsed, trade ground to a halt, and factory switches were shut down. In 1932, 1 in every 4 people in America was unemployed. That wealthy country which, just 3 years prior, had promised the public 2 cars in every garage was gone. In its place came a country of people sleeping wrapped in newspapers to keep warm in tin shantytowns known as Hoovervilles. Once proud fathers waited for hours in those infamous soup lines just to bring a bowl of hot food to their children. Take a good look at the photographs taken in that era, at the faces of those people. You won't see anger in those faces. There is only deep shame and brokenness, because the system had told them, if you work hard, you will succeed. This is the American dream. They had worked, but the system had devoured their labor at a gambling table. These events were not just an economic bankruptcy, but a societal trauma. People lost not only their wallets but also their self-respect. And no matter what the history books write, the thing that truly ended the Great Depression was not the New Deal policies or anything of the sort. What ended the Depression was, unfortunately, a much greater catastrophe: World War II. Unemployment ended only when the economic gears started turning for the war machine. Now, let's set aside those black and white frames, those long bread lines, and that deep despair in people's eyes for a moment. Let's lift our heads and look at today, at our own reality. What do you see? High-resolution screens, smartphones we never put down, the artificial intelligence revolution, and plans to go to Mars. You are probably thinking to yourself, we are different from them. We are smarter than those people. We have central banks that intervene in everything. We have technology. We have flawless algorithms. This is exactly the most insidious, most dangerous lie in history, because no matter how much technology advances, that immutable code of human nature, that dark core, never changes. Greed is the same today as it was in 1929. Fear is the same. And most importantly, the desire to get rich quick without paying the price is ingrained in our genes. In 1929, people looked at those wooden box radios and said, this is a new era. Nothing will ever be the same again. Today, we look at artificial intelligence and say the exact same thing word for word. Back then, people were pouring their salaries into RCA stocks without even understanding what business the company was in. Today, people are sinking their entire life savings into crypto projects whose underlying technology they haven't read even once, into meme coins, or into digital pictures, NFTs. The tools have evolved, granted. Fiber optic cables have replaced the telegraph, and blockchains have replaced the paper strips. But the name of the game being played is still the same: musical chairs. As long as the music plays, everyone is on the dance floor. Everyone is dancing, everyone is winning, and everyone thinks they are a market genius. But there is a bitter lesson that 1929 taught us, one we must never forget: that music cannot play forever. So, with all this technology and modern financial tools, is the risk today any less than it was in 1929? Unfortunately, no. In fact, we see that the situation is far more dire. The only difference lies in the size of the players. Who was using that deadly leverage in 1929? Was the shoeshine boy on the corner, the high school teacher, or the ambitious stockbroker? In other words, the debt rested on the shoulders of individuals. But today, the scale of the game has changed. Now, those indebted up to their necks are not ordinary citizens, but the states themselves and massive central banks. Since the 2008 crisis, the global economy has been inside a dangerous experiment not even tested in a laboratory setting: unlimited, unbacked money printing. Of course, they came up with a cooler, more technical name for this: quantitative easing. But if we set aside the fancy words, what was being done was nothing more than the application of that 1920s margin system on a global scale. Trillions of dollars, euros, and yen were continuously injected into the economy so that markets wouldn't fall and the system wouldn't collapse. So, where do you think these trillions printed out of thin air went? It certainly didn't go into our pockets. It didn't make the cheese or meat at the supermarket cheaper. This money was pumped directly into asset prices like a river. It flowed into the stock market, into skyscrapers into luxury consumption. Why do we think there is a housing crisis happening all over the world today? Why, while stock markets break records every day, does the person on the street ask, why are we getting poorer every day? Here is the answer. When that massive bubble burst in 1929, prices crashed and deflation, that is, a decrease in prices, occurred. Today, however, the system prefers to slowly kill the value of money so that the bubble doesn't burst. The fact that house prices, car tags, and stocks are skyrocketing while our salaries stagnate or increase only as much as inflation is not an economic success. This is the silent melting of the currency we use. The people of the 1920s thought they were getting rich on paper simply because the numbers were growing. We, on the other hand, are silently getting poorer because the paper money in our hands is melting away. This process we are experiencing is the largest and quietest wealth transfer history has ever seen. A massive, unstoppable river flowing from the saver to the borrower, from the worker to the asset owner. And it seems that this river has now started to strain against the dam walls. Perhaps the most terrifying difference distinguishing today from 1929 is the concept of speed. While the market was crashing on that Black Thursday of 1929, it took hours, even days, for news to reach the other end of the country. So back then, panic spread at a human pace. Today, however, the markets we inhabit operate not at human speed, but at the speed of light. High-frequency trading, HFT, complex algorithms, bots executing thousands of trades per second. Let's face it, we humans are no longer making most of the trades in the market. Control is largely in the hands of machines. And here is the frightening part. Machines have no fear, they have no mercy, and they have no hesitation to say, let's wait a bit. When a cold algorithm receives a sell signal, it can wipe out billions of dollars in milliseconds. Let's not look too far back. Remember the 2020 pandemic crash, or visualize the terrifying speed at which money fled when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. In 1929, people had to stand in physical lines in front of bank branches to save their money. Today, with a single click, billions of dollars can fly from one bank to another, from one country to the next, in mere seconds. This system we have built is now far more integrated than before, yet equally fragile. So much so that a butterfly flapping its wings in Tokyo doesn't just create a storm in New York. It can level New York. In 1929, the crisis began locally and spread globally over time. Today, however, a crisis is global the very second it begins. And unfortunately, there is no safe harbor where we can hide within this digital storm. So, how will this story end? Is it our destiny to return to those dark, gray depression days of the 1930s? Or will that famous consoling phrase ring true this time, and will everything be different? Optimists will tell us, do not fear, we have measures in place now. We have deposit guarantees, we have central banks that know what they are doing. However, there is a bitter truth they forget. No economic system can escape the cold laws of mathematics. Today, global debt has exceeded 3 times the global output. We have mortgaged the future of our own grandchildren just so we can live in a bit more prosperity today. And history teaches us this. Lenders are the world's most patient, but ultimately the most ruthless creditors. There are only 2 ways to dissolve this colossal mountain of debt standing before us. Either we will experience a massive default and collapse, meaning a 1929-style deflation, or hyperinflation where money becomes completely worthless. Central banks seem to have cast their vote for the second path, melting the debt through inflation, meaning we will once again foot the bill for this process as the money in our wallets shrinks a little more each day. We must also never forget this. The 1929 crisis did not just change the economy, it shook world politics to its very core. The atmosphere of desperation in those days paved the way for the rise of dictators in Europe, for radicalism, and ultimately for the devastation of World War II. Because when the economy deteriorates, societies turn volatile. When confidence vanishes, people cling to dangerous ideas they mistake for saviors. Let us look at the rising polarization, anger, and geopolitical tensions across the globe today through this lens. These are not isolated events. They are the tremors on the surface caused by the straining economic fault lines. In essence, those black and white images of 1929 do not whisper a distant past to us, but possible future. Rome fell. The Spanish Empire collapsed. The British Empire, on which the sun never set, declined. And the 1920s dream of eternal prosperity ended in a nightmare. The cycle of history plays no favorites. We are currently, perhaps, at the most critical turn of that cycle. The party is still going on. The lights are still on. Glasses are still being raised, but attentive ears can already hear the howling of the wind outside. The music is slowing down, and the real question is this: when the music stops completely, will we have a chair to sit on?